Woods Runner, Chapter 12. He found Annie huddled in some bushes, crying. When she saw him, she ran and threw herself at him, grabbing the edge of his shirt, silent except for the soft sobbing. For 3 days, unless she was asleep or tending to herself, she would not get any more than 4 feet away from him for 3 solid days. She held on to his clothing and did not say a word in all that time. At night, he would wrap her in his blanket and sit away from the glow of the fire and doze, and she would cry in her sleep almost all night. It bothered him that she had no shoes or moccasins, and he had no leather to make a pair for her, but her bare feet were amazingly tough, and she kept up with the rapid pace much better than he would have expected. They drank from creeks, which were common, and shared the small amount of food Ma had given him. Annie did not eat for the first 3 days, and he worried that although she drank. But in the evening of the third day, she took some food and seemed to come out of the cloud she was in, little by little. He was having a difficult time with almost everything. The jolt from what his life had been just weeks ago to what it now had been so sudden, the gulf so vast. And he felt he was in a completely different world, one dominated by violence and insanity. The woods were the one thing he knew and still believed in. He was thankful for the haven of the forest as they traveled. Still, this rage would not go away. He stifled it, but he seethed with anger every time he thought of the Hessians and how they had killed the Clarks, of how they had tired or how they've tried to kill Annie, or how the raiders had slaughtered the peaceful settlers for no reason. He wanted to punish them, make them pay for what they'd done, and could think of nothing to do except act as insane and violent as they had. Kill someone, find someone in a red coat and shoot him. He knew it was not something he could do, even though he thought of it. And so he drove himself and unfortunately Annie in a forced march that covered over 15 miles a day. It would not have been so hard except the trail had become a proper road. There was still forest on either side, but settlements, then small towns appeared regularly. They often saw local people or detachments of redcoats marching on the road. They avoided everybody. Samuel trusted no one, not even people who might have been friendly. Annie complained only once. "We jump into the woods every time we see somebody," she said. "They can't all be bad." "Yes," Samuel said, thinking of the Hessians. "They can. Every single one of them can be bad, so we hide. And that's it." His voice had an edge that kept her from arguing. They worked around the settlements and the small towns, sticking to the trees, and on day 5, they'd been out of food for a day and a half. Samuel shot a deer and took an afternoon. "We'll be back in the woods to make a small fire with flint and steel and a little powder." He cooked the 2 back legs of the deer with stakes holding them over the fire, and when the meat was still rare, cut pieces from one of the legs, and they ate at it. They ate it, squatting by the fire. He also cut off the strips of meat along the lower backbone, the tenderloin. Although it was quite small, he cooked that as well to save for later. They ate a whole back leg sitting there until Annie's face was coated with grease. They wrapped the excess in the cloth Ma had given him and were up and moving again, Samuel not wanting to waste daylight. He could think of little but finding his parents and getting them away from their captors. But he also realized that the odds were not good. He knew nothing of cities or even towns, but New York City must be large and filled with people who would not be helpful since the British were there. Try as he might, he couldn't think of a way to get into the city safely to find his mother and father. With meat in his belly, he fairly loped along so fast that at last Annie gasped, "You got to slow down. I can't run like a deer." He slowed but kept the pace steady, so that when it was dark, hard dark, and he stopped, Annie fell asleep almost the instant he wrapped the bedroll blanket around her. He decided to make a cold camp and didn't start a fire. Since there was no smoke, the bugs, mostly mosquitoes, found him at once. They weren't as bad as they'd been on his hunting trips on the frontier, but then he always had a fire and the smoke to keep them away. He was tired, although not like Annie. He had some thinking to do. It took him a while to get his mind off mosquitoes, and by the time there was a new sliver of moon, in the pale silver light, he saw Annie's face wrapped in the blanket, just showing enough to let her breathe, and his heart went out to her. She was only 8, he thought, maybe 9, and her whole world had been absolutely destroyed. Were there many like her? Everything gone because of this war? The innocent ones were the worst part of it all. His mother and father making a life on the frontier, just wanting to be left alone. His mother trying to get the garden to grow. His father learning how to use tools, how to make his own house, wanting only to work and read and think and live a quiet, simple life with his family. All gone. His own life gutted. Not as much as Annie's, but enough. He had to get his parents back. How? What to do? There were so many unknown factors that the question seemed impossible. He was only one person with a rifle. Oh, yes, he thought, smiling grimly, and a knife. And he felt that the entire world he was heading into was against him. He would have to get around them, the people in the world, some way, somehow. How? His eyes closed and opened, closed again. His questions spiraled down as he leaned back against the tree and slept. Communication. Civilian deaths. Civilian mortalities have always been underreported in wars and are nearly impossible to verify. Most historians and governments are forced to guess the numbers because not only are birth and death certificates, church records, tax rolls, and immigration documents frequently destroyed during combat, but the true numbers are, in many cases, never counted in order to hide them from the country's own people as well as the enemy. Once mass weapons such as cannons and guns were developed and used by the military, far more civilians were killed simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. All right, that's chapter 12.